Section 24 of Whirligigs by O. Henry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Blind Man's Holiday, Part 2. Two ponderous policemen were conducting between them a woman dressed as if for the stage, in a short white satiny skirt reaching to the knees, pink stockings, and a sort of sleeveless bodice, bright with relucent, armor-like scales. Upon her curly light hair was perched, at a rollicking angle, a shining tin helmet. The costume was to be instantly recognized as one of those amazing conceptions to which competition has harried the inventors of the spectacular ballet. One of the officers bore a long cloak upon his arm, which doubtless had been intended to veil the candid attractions of their effulgent prisoner, but for some reason it had not been called into use, to the vociferous delight of the tail of the procession. Compelled by a sudden and vigorous movement of the woman, the parade halted before the window by which Lorison stood. He saw that she was young, and, at the first glance, was deceived by a sophistical prettiness of her face, which waned before more judicious scrutiny. Her look was bold and reckless, and upon her countenance, where yet the contours of youth survived, were the finger marks of old age's credentialed courier. Late hours. The young woman fixed her unshrinking gaze upon Lorison, and called to him in the voice of the wronged heroine in the straits. "Say, you look like a good fellow. Come and put up the bail, won't you? I've done nothing to get pinched for. It's all a mistake. See how they're treating me? You won't be sorry if you'll help me out of this. Think of your sister or your girl being dragged along the streets this way. I say, come along now like a good fellow." It may be that Lorison, in spite of the unconvincing bathos of this appeal, showed a sympathetic face, for one of the officers left the woman's side and went over to him. "It's all right, sir," he said, in a husky, confidential tone. "She's the right party. We took her after the first act at the Greenlight Theater, on a wire from the Chief of Police of Chicago. It's only a square or two to the station. Her rig's pretty bad, but she refused to change clothes, or rather," added the officer with a smile, "to put on some. I thought I'd explain matters to you so you wouldn't think she was being imposed upon." "What is the charge?" asked Lorison. "Grand larceny, diamonds. Her husband is a jeweler in Chicago. She cleaned his showcase of the sparklers and skipped with a comic opera troupe." The policeman, perceiving that the interest of the entire group of spectators was centered upon himself and Lorison, their conference being regarded as a possible new complication, was fain to prolong the situation, which reflected his own importance, by a little afterpiece of philosophical comment. "A gentleman like you, sir," he went on affably, "would never notice it. But it comes in my line to observe what an immense amount of trouble is made by that combination. I mean the stage, diamonds, and light-headed women who aren't satisfied with good homes. I tell you, sir, a man these days and nights wants to know what his women folk are up to." The policeman smiled a good night and returned to the side of his charge, who had been intently watching Lorison's face during the conversation, no doubt for some indication of his intention to render succor. Now, at the failure of the sign, and at the movement made to continue the ignominious progress, she abandoned hope and addressed him thus, pointedly: "You damned chalk-faced quitter, you was thinking of giving me a hand, but you let the cop talk you out of it the first word. You're a dandy to tie to. Say, if you ever get a girl, she'll have a picnic. Won't she work you to the Queen's taste? Oh, my!" she concluded with a taunting, shrill laugh that rasped Lorison like a saw. The policeman urged her forward. The delighted train of gaping followers closed up the rear, and the captive Amazon, accepting her fate, extended the scope of her maledictions so that none in hearing might seem to be slighted. Then came upon Lorison an overwhelming revulsion of his perspective. It may be that he had been ripe for it, that the abnormal condition of mind in which he had for so long existed was already about to revert to its balance. However, it is certain that the events of the last few minutes had furnished the channel, if not the impetus, for the change. the initial determining influence had been so small a thing as the fact and manner of his having been approached by the officer. The agent had, by the style of his accost, restored the loiterer to his former place in society. In an instant he had been transformed from a somewhat rancid prowler along the fishy side streets of gentility into an honest gentleman, with whom even so lordly a guardian as the peace might agreeably exchange the compliments. This, then, first broke the spell, and set thrilling in him a resurrected longing for the fellowship of his kind, and the rewards of the virtuous. To what end, he vehemently asked himself, was this fanciful self-accusation, this empty renunciation, this moral squeamishness through which he had been led to abandon what was his heritage in life, and not beyond his deserts? Technically, he was uncondemned. His sole guilty spot was in thought rather than deed, and cognizance of it unshared by others. For what good, moral or sentimental, did he slink, retreating like a hedgehog from his own shadow, to and fro in this musty Bohemia that lacked even the picturesque? But the thing that struck home and set him raging was the part played by the Amazon prisoner. To the counterpart of that astounding belligerent, identical at least in way of experience to the one by her own confession, thus had fallen, had he, not 3 hours since, been united in marriage. How desirable and natural it had seemed to him then, and how monstrous it seemed now. How the words of Diamond Thief number 2 yet burned in his ears. If you ever get a girl, she'll have a picnic. What did that mean but that women instinctively knew him for one they could hoodwink? Still again, there reverberated the policeman's sapient contribution to his agony. A man these days and nights wants to know what his women folks are up to. Oh, yes, he had been a fool. He had looked at things from the wrong standpoint. But the wildest note in all the clamor was struck by Payne's forefinger. Jealousy. Now, at least, he felt that keenest sting, a mounting love unworthily bestowed. Whatever she might be, he loved her. He bore in his own breast his doom. A grating, comic flavor to his predicament struck him suddenly, and he laughed creakingly as he swung down the echoing pavement. An impetuous desire to act, to battle with his fate, seized him. He stopped upon his heel and smote his palms together triumphantly. His wife was where? But there was a tangible link, an outlet more or less navigable, through which his derelict ship of matrimony might yet be safely towed. The priest. Like all imaginative men with pliable natures, Lorison was, when thoroughly stirred, apt to become tempestuous. With a high and stubborn indignation upon him, he retraced his steps to the intersecting street by which he had come. Down this he hurried to the corner where he had parted with, an astringent grimace tinctured the thought, his wife. Thence, still back he harked. Following through an unfamiliar district, he stimulated recollections of the way they had come from that preposterous wedding. Many times he went abroad and nosed his way back to the trail, furious. At last, when he reached the dark, calamitous building in which his madness had culminated, and found the black hallway, he dashed down it, perceiving no light or sound. But he raised his voice, hailing loudly, reckless of everything but that he should find the old mischief-maker with the eyes that looked too far away to see the disaster he had wrought. The door opened, and in the stream of light Father Rogan stood, his book in hand, with his finger marking the place. "Ah!" cried Lorison, "you're the man I want. I had a wife of you a few hours ago. I would not trouble you, but I neglected to note how it was done. Will you oblige me with the information whether the business is beyond remedy?" "Come inside," said the priest. "There are other lodgers in the house who might prefer sleep to even a gratified curiosity." Lorison entered the room and took the chair offered him. The priest's eyes looked a courteous interrogation. "I must apologize again," said the young man, "for so soon intruding upon you with my marital infelicities. but as my wife has neglected to furnish me with her address, I am deprived of the legitimate recourse of a family row." "I am quite a plain man," said Father Rogan pleasantly, "but I do not see how I am to ask your questions." "Pardon my indirectness," said Lorison, "but I will ask one. In this room tonight you pronounced me to be a husband. You afterwards spoke of additional rites or performances that either should or could be effected. I paid little attention to your words then, but I am hungry to hear them repeated now. As matters stand, am I married past all help?" "You are as legally and as firmly bound," said the priest, "as though it had been done in a cathedral in the presence of thousands. The additional observances I referred to are not necessary to the strictest legality of the act, but were advised as a precaution for the future, for convenience of proof in such contingencies as wills, inheritances, and the like." Lorison laughed harshly. "Many thanks," he said. "Then there is no mistake, and I am the happy Benedict. I suppose I should go stand upon the bridal corner, and when my wife gets through walking the streets she will look me up." Father Rogan regarded him calmly. "My son," he said, "when a man and woman come to me to be married, I always marry them. I do this for the sake of other people whom they might go away and marry if they do not marry each other. As you see, I do not seek your confidence, but your case seems to me to be one not altogether devoid of interest. Very few marriages that have come to my notice have brought such well-expressed regret within so short a time. I will hazard one question. Were you not under the impression that you loved the lady you married at the time you did so?" "Loved her?" cried Lorison wildly. "Never so well as now, though she told me she deceived and sinned and stole. Never more than now, when perhaps she is laughing at the fool she cajoled and left, with scarcely a word, to return to God only knows what particular line of her former folly." Father Rogan answered nothing. During the silence that succeeded, he sat with a quiet expectation beaming in his full, lambent eye. "If you would listen," began Lorison. The priest held up his hand. "As I hoped," he said. "I thought you would trust me. Wait but a moment." He brought a long clay pipe, filled and lighted it. "Now, my son," he said. Lorison poured a 12 months' accumulated confidence into Father Rogan's ears. He told all, not sparing himself or omitting the facts of his past, the events of the night, or his disturbing conjectures and fears. "The main point," said the priest, when he had concluded, "seems to me to be this. Are you reasonably sure that you love this woman whom you have married?" "Why," exclaimed Lorison, rising impulsively to his feet, "why should I deny it? But look at me. Am fish, flesh, or fowl? That is the main point to me, I assure you." "I understand you," said the priest, also rising and laying down his pipe. "The situation is one that has taxed the endurance of much older men than you. In fact, especially much older men than you. I will try to relieve you from it, and this night. You shall see for yourself into exactly what predicament you have fallen, and how you shall, possibly, be extricated. There is no evidence so credible as that of the eyesight." Father Rogan moved about the room and donned a soft black hat. Buttoning his coat to his throat, he laid a hand on the doorknob. "Let us walk," he said. The two went out upon the street. The priest turned his face down it, and Lorison walked with him through a squalid district, where the houses loomed awry and desolate-looking high above them. Presently they turned into a less dismal side street, where the houses were smaller, and though hinting of the most meager comfort, lacked the concentrated wretchedness of the more populous byways. At a segregated 2-story house, Father Rogan halted, and mounted the steps with the confidence of a familiar visitor. He ushered Lorison into a narrow hallway, faintly lighted by a cobwebbed hanging lamp. Almost immediately a door to the right opened, and a dingy Irishwoman protruded her head. "Good evening to you, Mistress Geehan," said the priest, unconsciously, it seemed, falling into a delicately flavored brogue. "And it is yourself can tell me if Norah has gone out again the night, maybe?" "Oh, yes, your blessed reverence, sure, and I can tell you the same. The pretty darling went out as usual, but a bit later, and she says, 'Mother Geoghegan,' says she, 'it's me last night out. Praise the saints, 'tis night is. And oh, your reverence, the swate beautiful drame of a dress that has this tomy, white satin and silk and ribbons and lace about the neck and arms, 'twas a sin, your reverence, the gold was sprint upon it.'" The priest heard Lorison catch his breath painfully, and a faint smile flickered across his own clean-cut mouth. "Well, then, Mistress Geoghegan," said he, "I'll just step upstairs and see the bit boy for a minute, and I'll take this gentleman up with me." "He'll wake him," said the woman. "I've just come down from sitting with him the last hour, telling him the fine stories of old County Tyrone. 'Tis a greedy godson, it is, your reverence, for me stories." "Small the doubt," said Father Rogan. "There's no rockin' would put him to sleep the quicker, I'm thinking." Amid the woman's shrill protest against the retort, the two men ascended the steep stairway. The priest pushed open the door of a room near its top. "Is that you already, sister?" drawled a sweet, childish voice from the darkness. "It is only old Father Denny to come see you, darling, and a fine gentleman I brought to make you and call. And you reserve us fast asleep in bed. Shame on your manners." "Oh, Father Denny, is that you? I'm glad. And will you light the lamp, please? It's on the table by the door. And quit talking like Mother Geoghegan, Father Denny." The priest lit the lamp, and Lorison saw a tiny, tousle-haired boy with a thin, delicate face sitting up in a small bed in a corner. Quickly, also, his rapid glance considered the room and its contents. It was furnished with more than comfort, and its adornments plainly indicated a woman's discerning taste. An open door beyond revealed the blackness of an adjoining room's interior. The boy clutched both of Father Rogan's hands. "I'm so glad you came," he said. "But why did you come in the night? Did sister send you?" "Off with ye. Am I to be sent about at me age, as was Terence McShane of Ballymahone? I come on me own responsibility." Lorison had also advanced to the boy's bedside. He was fond of children, and the wee fellow, laying himself down to sleep alone in the dark room, stirred his heart. "Aren't you afraid, little man?" he asked, stooping down beside him. "Sometimes," answered the boy with a shy smile, "when the rats make too much noise. But nearly every night, when sister goes out, Mother Geoghegan stays a while with me and tells me funny stories. I'm not often afraid, sir." "This brave little gentleman," said Father Rogan, "is a scholar of mine. Every day, from 6:30 to 8:30, when sister comes for him, he stops in my study, and we find out what's in the inside of books. He knows multiplication, division, and fractions, and he's troubling me to begin with the Chronicles of Ciaran of Clonmacnoise, Currach MacCullen, and Curran O'Loughlin, the great Irish historians." The boy was evidently accustomed to the priest's Celtic pleasantries. A little appreciative grin was all the attention the insinuation of pedantry received. Lorison, to have saved his life, could not have put to the child one of those vital questions that were wildly beating about unanswered in his own brain. The little fellow was very like Norah. He had the same shining hair and candid eyes. "Oh, Father Denny," cried the boy suddenly, "I forgot to tell you. Sister is not going away at night any more. She told me so when she kissed me good night as she was leaving. And she said she was so happy, and then she cried. Wasn't that queer? But I'm glad, aren't you?" "Yes, lad. And now, ye O'Mahon, go to sleep, and say good night. We must be going." "Which shall I do first, Father Denny?" "Faith, he caught me again. Wait till I get the Senech into the Annals of Tarraguch, the hagiographer, and I'll give him enough of the Irish idiom to make him more respectful." The light was out, and the small, brave voice bidding them good night from the dark room. They groped downstairs and tore away from the garrulity of Mother Geoghegan. Again the priest steered them through the dim ways, but this time in another direction. His conductor was serenely silent, and Lorison followed his example to the extent of seldom speaking. Serene he could not be. His heart beat suffocatingly in his breast. The following of this blind, menacing trail was pregnant with he knew not what humiliating revelation to be delivered at its end. They came into a more pretentious street where trade, it could be surmised, flourished by day, and again the priest paused, this time before a lofty building whose great doors and windows in the lowest floor were carefully shuttered and barred. Its higher apertures were dark, save in the third story, the windows of which were brilliantly lighted. Lorison's ear caught a distant, regular, pleasing thrumming as of music above. They stood at an angle to the building. Up along the side nearest them mounted an iron stairway. At its top was an upright, illuminated parallelogram. Father Rogan had stopped and stood musing. "I will say this much," he remarked thoughtfully. "I believe you to be a better man than you think yourself to be, a better man than I thought some hours ago. But do not take this," he added with a smile, "as much praise. I promise you a possible deliverance from an unhappy perplexity. I will have to modify that promise. I can only remove the mystery that enhanced that perplexity. Your deliverance depends upon yourself. Come." He led his companion up the stairway. Halfway up, Lorison caught him by the sleeve. "Remember," he gasped, "I love that woman." "You desire to know." Go on." The priest reached the landing at the top of the stairway. Lorison, behind him, saw the illuminated space was the glass upper half of a door opening into the lighted room. The rhythmic music increased as they neared it. The stair shook with the mellow vibrations. Lorison stopped breathing when he set foot upon the highest step, for the priest stood aside and motioned him to look through the glass of the door. His eyes, accustomed to the darkness, met first a blinding glare, and then he made out the faces and forms of many people, amid an extravagant display of splendid robings, billowy laces, brilliant-hued finery, ribboned silks, and misty drapery. And then he caught the meaning of that jarring hum, and he saw the tired, pale, happy face of his wife, bending, as were a score of others, over her sewing-machine, toiling. Here was the folly she pursued, and the end of his quest. But not his deliverance. Though even then remorse struck him. His shamed soul fluttered once more before it retired to make room for the other and better one. For, to temper his thrill of joy, the shine of the satin and the glimmer of ornaments recalled the disturbing figure of the bespangled Amazon, and the base duplicate histories lit by the glare of footlights and stolen diamonds. It is past the wisdom of him who only sets the scenes, either to praise or blame the man. But this time his love overcame his scruples. He took a quick step and reached out his hand for the doorknob. Father Rogan was quicker to arrest it and draw him back. "You use my trust in you queerly," said the priest sternly. "What are you about to do?" "I am going to my wife," said Lorison. "Let me pass." "Listen," said the priest, holding him firmly by the arm. "I am about to put you in possession of a piece of knowledge of which, thus far, you have scarcely proved deserving. I do not think you ever will, but I will not dwell upon that. You see in that room the woman you married, working for a frugal living for herself and a generous comfort for an idolized brother. This building belongs to the chief costumer of the city. For months the advance orders for the coming Mardi Gras festival have kept the work going day and night. I myself secured employment here for Nora. She toils here each night from 9 o'clock until daylight, and besides carries home with her some of the finer costumes requiring more delicate needlework, and works there part of the day. Somehow, you two have remained strangely ignorant of each other's lives. Are you convinced now that your wife is not walking the streets?" "Let me go to her," cried Lorison, again struggling, "and beg her forgiveness." "Sir," said the priest, "do you owe me nothing? Be quiet. It seems so often that heaven lets fall its choicest gifts into the hands that must be taught to hold them. Listen again. You forgot that repentant sin must not compromise, but look up for redemption, to the purest and best. You went to her with a fine-spun sophistry that peace could be found in a mutual guilt, and she, fearful of losing what her heart so craved, thought it worth the price to buy it with a desperate, pure, beautiful lie. I have known her since the day she was born. She is as innocent and unsullied in life and deed as a holy saint. In that lowly street where she dwells, she first saw the light, and she has lived there ever since, spending her days in generous self-sacrifice for others. Oh, ye spalpeen, continued Father Reagan, raising his finger in kindly anger at Lorison. What for, I wonder, could she be after, making a fool of herself and shaming her soul with lies for the likes of you? Sir, said Lorison, trembling, say what you please of me. Doubt it as you must. I will yet prove my gratitude to you and my devotion to her. But let me speak to her once now. Let me kneel just for one moment at her feet and— Tut, tut, said the priest. How many acts of love drama do you think an old bookworm like me capable of witnessing? Besides, what kind of figures do we cut? Spying upon the mysteries of midnight millinery? Go to meet your wife tomorrow as she ordered you, and obey her thereafter, and maybe sometime I shall get forgiveness for the part I have played in this night's work. Off with you now down the stairs. 'Tis late, and an old man like me should be taking his rest. End of Part 2 of Blind Man's Holiday. Section 25 of Whirligigs by O. Henry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Madame Bo-Peep of the Ranches. Part 1. Aunt Ellen, said Octavia, cheerfully, as she threw her black kid gloves carefully at the dignified Persian cat on the window-seat. I'm a pauper. You are so extreme in your statements, Octavia dear, said Aunt Ellen, mildly, looking up from her paper. If you find yourself temporarily in need of some small change for bonbons, you will find my purse in the drawer of the writing-desk. Octavia Beaupré removed her hat and seated herself on a footstool near her aunt's chair, clasping her hands about her knees. Her slim and flexible figure, clad in a modish morning costume, accommodated itself easily and gracefully to the trying position. Her bright and youthful face, with its pair of sparkling, life-enamoured eyes, tried to compose itself to the seriousness that the occasion seemed to demand. You good auntie, it isn't a case of bonbons. It is abject, staring, unpicturesque poverty, with ready-made clothes, gasoline gloves, and probably 1 o'clock dinners all waiting with the traditional wolf at the door. I've just come from my lawyer, auntie, and please, ma'am, I ain't got nothing at all. Flowers, lady? Buttonhole, gentlemen? Pencils, sir, 3 for 5 to help a poor widow. Do I do it nicely, auntie, or as a breadwinner accomplishment were my lessons in elocution entirely wasted? Do be serious, my dear, said Aunt Ellen, letting her papers fall to the floor long enough to tell me what you mean. Colonel Beaupré's estate? Colonel Beaupré's estate, interrupted Octavia, emphasizing her words with appropriate dramatic gestures, is of Spanish castellar architecture. Colonel Beaupré's resources are wind. Colonel Beaupré's stocks are water. Colonel Beaupré's income is all in. The statement lacks the legal technicalities to which I have been listening for an hour, but that is what it means when translated. Octavia, Aunt Ellen was now visibly possessed by consternation. I can hardly believe it. And it was the impression that he was worth $1 million. And the De Paysters themselves introduced him. Octavia rippled out a laugh, and then became properly grave. De mortis nil, auntie. Not even the rest of it. The dear old Colonel. What a gold brick he was, after all. I paid for my bargain fairly. I'm all here, am I not? Items, eyes, fingers, toes, youth, old family, unquestionable position in society, as called for in the contract. No wildcat stock here. Octavia picked up the morning paper from the floor. But I'm not going to squeal. Isn't that what they call it when you rail at fortune because you've lost the game? She turned the pages of the paper calmly. Stock market? No use for that. Society's doings, that's done. Here's my page, the wish column. A Van Dresser could not be said to want for anything, of course. Chambermaids, cooks, canvassers, stenographers. "Dear," said Auntie, with a little tremor in her voice, "please do not talk in that way, even if your affairs are in so unfortunate a condition. There's my 3,000. Octavia sprang up lithely and deposited a smart kiss on the delicate cheek of the prim little elderly maid. "Blessed Annie, your 3,000 is just sufficient to insure your Hyson to be free from willow leaves and keep the Persian in sterilized cream. I know I'd be welcome, but I prefer to strike bottom like Beelzebub rather than hang around like the Peri listening to the music from the side entrance. I'm going to earn my own living. There's nothing else to do. I'm a... Oh, I'd forgotten. There's one thing saved from the wreck. It's a corral. No, a ranch. Let me see. Texas. An asset, dear old Mr. Bannister called it. How pleased he was to show me something he could describe as unencumbered. I've a description of it among those stupid papers he made me bring away with me from his office. I'll try and find it." Octavia found her shopping bag and drew from it a long envelope filled with typewritten documents. "A ranch in Texas," sighed Aunt Ellen. "It sounds to me more like a liability than an asset. Those are places where the centipedes are found, and cowboys and fandangos." "The Rancho de las Sombras," read Octavia from a sheet of violently purple typewriting, "is situated 110 miles southeast of San Antonio, and 38 miles from its nearest railroad station, Nopal, on the I&GN Ranch. Consists of 7,680 acres of well-watered land, with title conferred by state patents, and 22 sections, or 14,080 acres, partly under yearly running lease and partly bought under state 20-year purchase act. 8,000 graded merino sheep, with the necessary equipment of horses, vehicles, and general ranch paraphernalia. Ranch house built of brick with 6 rooms comfortably furnished according to the requirements of the climate, all within a strong barbed wire fence. The present ranch manager seems to be competent and reliable, and is rapidly placing upon a paying basis a business that, in other hands, had been allowed to suffer from neglect and misconduct. This property was secured by Colonel Beaupré in a deal with the Western Irrigation Syndicate, and the title to it seems to be perfect. With careful management and the natural increase of land values, it ought to be made the foundation for a comfortable fortune for its owner." When Octavia ceased reading, Aunt Ellen uttered something as near a sniff as her breeding permitted. "The prospectus," she went on, with uncompromising metropolitan suspicion, "doesn't mention the centipedes or the Indians. And you never did like mutton, Octavia. I don't see what advantage you can derive from this desert." But Octavia was in a trance. Her eyes were steadily regarding something quite beyond their focus. Her lips were parted, and her face was lighted by a kindling furor of the explorer, the ardent striding disquiet of the adventurer. Suddenly she clasped her hands together exultantly. "The problem solves itself, Auntie," she cried. "I'm going to that ranch. I'm going to live on it. I'm going to learn to like mutton, and even concede the good qualities of centipedes, at a respectful distance. It is just what I need. It's a new life that comes when my old one is just ending. It's a release, Auntie. It isn't a narrowing. Think of the gallops over those leagues of prairies, with the wind tugging at the roots of your hair, the coming close to the earth and learning over again the stories of the growing grass and the little wildflowers without names. Glorious is what it will be. Shall I be a shepherdess with a Watteau hat and a crook to keep the bad wolves from the lambs, or a typical Western ranch girl with short hair like the pictures of her in the Sunday papers? I think the latter, and they'll have my picture, too, with the wildcats I've slain, single-handed, hanging from my saddle horn. From the 400 to the flocks is the way they'll headline it, and they'll print photographs of the old Van Dresser mansion and the church where I was married. They won't have my picture, but they'll get an artist to draw it. I'll be wild and woolly, and I'll grow my own wool." "Octavia!" Aunt Ellen condensed into the one word all the protests she was unable to utter. "Don't say a word, Auntie. I'm going. I'll see the sky at night fit down on the world like a big butter dish cover, and I'll make friends again with the stars that I haven't had a chat with since I was a wee child. I wish to go. I'm tired of all this. I'm glad I haven't any money. I could bless Colonel Beaupré for the ranch, and forgive him for all his bubbles. What if the life will be rough and lonely? I deserve it. I shut my heart to everything except that miserable ambition. I wish to go away and forget. Octavia swerved suddenly to her knees, laid her flushed face in her auntie's lap, and shook with turbulent sobs. Aunt Ellen bent over her and smoothed the coppery brown hair. "I didn't know," she said gently. "I didn't know that. Who was it, dear?" When Mrs. Octavia Beaupré, née Van Dresser, stepped from the train at Nopal, her manner lost, for the moment, some of that easy certitude which had always marked her movements. The town was of recent establishment, and seemed to have been hastily constructed of undressed lumber and flapping canvas. The element that had congregated about the station, though not offensively demonstrative, was clearly composed of citizens accustomed to and prepared for rude alarms. Octavia stood on the platform, against the telegraph office, and attempted to choose by intuition from the swaggering, straggling string of loungers the manager of the Rancho de las Sombras, who had been instructed by Mr. Bannister to meet her there. The tall, serious-looking elderly man in the blue flannel shirt and white tie she thought must be he. But no, he passed by, removing his gaze from the lady as hers rested on him, according to the Southern custom. The manager, she thought, with some impatience at being kept waiting, should have no difficulty in selecting her. Young women wearing the most recent thing in ash-colored traveling suits were not so plentiful in Nopal. Thus keeping a speculative watch on all persons of possible managerial aspect, Octavia, with a catching breath and a start of surprise, suddenly became aware of Teddy Westlake hurrying along the platform in the direction of the train, of Teddy Westlake, or his sun-browned ghost in cheviot, boots, and leather-girdled hat, Theodore Westlake, Jr., amateur polo almost champion, all-around butterfly, and cumberer of the soil, but a broader, surer, more emphasized and determined Teddy than the one she had known a year ago when she last saw him. He perceived Octavia at almost the same time, deflected his course, and steered for her in his old, straightforward way. Something like awe came upon her as the strangeness of his metamorphosis was brought into closer range. The rich red-brown of his complexion brought out so vividly his straw-colored mustache and steel-gray eyes. He seemed more grown up and somehow farther away. But when he spoke, the old boyish Teddy came back again. They had been friends from childhood. "Why, Tav!" he exclaimed, unable to reduce his perplexity to coherence. "How? What? When? Where?" "Train," said Octavia. "Necessity. 10 minutes ago. Home. Your complexion's gone, Teddy. Now, how? What? When? Where?" "I'm working down here," said Teddy. He cast side glances about the station as one does who tries to combine politeness with duty. "You didn't notice on the train," he asked, "an old lady with gray curls and a poodle who occupied 2 seats with her bundles and quarreled with the conductor, did you?" "I think not," answered Octavia, reflecting. "And you haven't, by any chance, noticed a big gray mustached man in a blue shirt and 6-shooters with little flakes of merino wool sticking in his hair, have you?" "Lots of 'em," said Teddy, with symptoms of mental delirium under the strain. "Do you happen to know any such individual?" "No, the description is imaginary. Is your interest in the old lady whom you describe a personal one?" "Never saw her in my life. She's painted entirely from fancy. She owns the little piece of property where I earn my bread and butter, the Rancho de las Sombras. I drove up to meet her according to arrangement with her lawyer." Octavia leaned against the wall of the telegraph office. Was this possible, and didn't he know? "Are you the manager of that ranch?" she asked weakly. "I am," said Teddy with pride. "I am Mrs. Beaupree," said Octavia faintly, "but my hair never would curl, and I was polite to the conductor." For a moment that strange grown-up look came back and removed Teddy miles away from her. "I hope you'll excuse me," he said rather awkwardly. "You see, I've been down here in the chaparral a year. I haven't heard. Give me your checks, please, and I'll have your traps loaded into the wagon. Jose will follow with them. We'll travel ahead in the buckboard." Seated by Teddy in a featherweight buckboard behind a pair of wild cream-colored Spanish ponies, Octavia abandoned all thought for the exhilaration of the present. They swept out of the little town and down the level road toward the south. Soon the road dwindled and disappeared, and they struck across a world carpeted with an endless reach of curly mesquite grass. The wheels made no sound. The tireless ponies bounded ahead at an unbroken gallop. The temperate wind, made fragrant by the thousands of acres of blue and yellow wildflowers, roared gloriously in their ears. The motion was aerial, ecstatic, with a thrilling sense of perpetuity in its effect. Octavia sat silent, possessed by a feeling of elemental, sensual bliss. Teddy seemed to be wrestling with some internal problem. "I'm going to call you Madama," he announced, as the result of his labors. "That is what the Mexicans will call you. They're nearly all Mexicans on the ranch, you know. That seems to me about the proper thing." "Very well, Mr. Westlake," said Octavia primly. "Oh, now," said Teddy in some consternation, "that's carrying the thing too far, isn't it?" "Don't worry me with your beastly etiquette. I'm just beginning to live. Don't remind me of anything artificial. If only this air could be bottled. This much alone is worth coming for." "Oh, look, there goes a deer." "Jackrabbit," said Teddy without turning his head. Might I drive?" suggested Octavia, panting, with rose-tinted cheeks and the eye of an eager child. "On one condition. Might I smoke?" "Forever!" cried Octavia, taking the lines with solemn joy. "How shall I know which way to drive?" "Keep her south by southeast, and all sail set. You see the black speck on the horizon under that lowermost Gulf cloud? That's a group of live oaks and a landmark. Steer halfway between that and the little hill to the left. I'll recite you the whole code of driving rules for the Texas prairies. Keep the reins from under the horse's feet and swear at 'em frequent." "I'm too happy to swear, Ted. And oh, why do people buy yachts or travel in palace cars when a buckboard and a pair of plugs and a spring morning like this can satisfy all desire?" "Now I'll ask you," protested Teddy, who was furtively striking match after match on the dashboard, "not to call those denizens of the air plugs. They can kick out 100 miles between daylight and dark." At last he succeeded in snatching a light for his cigar from the flame held in the hollow of his hands. "Room," said Octavia intensely. "That's what produces the effect. I know now what I've wanted. Scope, range, room." "Smoking room," said Teddy unsentimentally. "I love to smoke in a buckboard. The wind blows the smoke into you and out again. It saves exertion." The two fell so naturally into their old-time good-fellowship that it was only by degrees that a sense of the strangeness of the new relations between them came to be felt. "Madama," said Teddy wonderingly, "however did you get it into your bead to cut the crowd and come down here? Is it a fad now among the upper classes to trot off to sheep ranches instead of off to Newport?" "I was broke, Teddy," said Octavia sweetly, with her interest centered upon steering safely between a Spanish dagger plant and a clump of chaparral. "I haven't a thing in the world but this ranch. Not even any other home to go to." "Come now," said Teddy anxiously but incredulously. "You don't mean it." "When my husband," said Octavia with a shy slurring of the word, "died 3 months ago, I thought I had a reasonable amount of the world's goods. His lawyer exploded that theory in a 60-minute, fully illustrated lecture. I took to the sheep as a last resort. Do you happen to know of any fashionable caprice among the gilded youth of Manhattan that induces them to abandon polo and club windows to become managers of sheep ranches? "It is easily explained in my case," responded Teddy promptly. "I had to go to work. I couldn't have earned my board in New York, so I chummed a while with old Sanford, one of the syndicate that owned the ranch before Colonel Beaupré bought it, and got a place down here. I wasn't manager at first. I jogged around on ponies and studied the business in detail until I got all the points in my head. I saw where it was losing and what the remedies were, and then Sanford put me in charge. I get $100 a month, and I earn it." "Poor Teddy," said Octavia with a smile. "You needn't. I like it. I save half my wages, and I'm as hard as a water plug. It beats polo." "Will it furnish bread and tea and jam for another outcast from civilization?" "The spring shearing," said the manager, "just cleared up a deficit in last year's business. Wastefulness and inattention have been the rule heretofore. The autumn clip will leave a small profit over all expenses. Next year there will be a jam." When about 4 o'clock in the afternoon the ponies rounded a gentle, brush-covered hill and then swooped like a double cream-colored cyclone upon the Rancho de las Sombras, Octavia gave a little cry of delight. A lordly grove of magnificent live oaks cast an area of grateful, cool shade, whence the ranch had drawn its name, de las Sombras, of the shadows. The house, of red brick, one story, ran low and long beneath the trees. Through its middle, dividing its 6 rooms in half, extended a broad, arched passageway, picturesque with flowering cactus and hanging red earthen jars. A gallery, low and broad, encircled the building. Vines climbed about it, and the adjacent ground was, for a space, covered with transplanted grass and shrubs. A little lake, long and narrow, glimmered in the sun at the rear. Further away stood the shacks of the Mexican workers, the corrals, wool sheds, and shearing pens. To the right lay the low hills, splattered with dark patches of chaparral. To the left, the unbounded green prairie, blending against the blue heavens. "It's a home, Teddy," said Octavia breathlessly. "That's what it is. It's a home." "Not bad for a sheep ranch," admitted Teddy, with excusable pride. "I've been tinkering on it at odd times." A Mexican youth sprang from somewhere in the grass and took charge of the creams. The mistress and the manager entered the house. "Here's Mrs. McIntyre," said Teddy, as a placid, neat, elderly lady came out upon the gallery to meet them. "Mrs. Mac, here's the boss. Very likely she will be wanting a hunk of ham and a dish of beans after her drive." Mrs. McIntyre, the housekeeper, as much a fixture on the place as the lake or the live oaks, received the imputation of the ranch's resources of refreshment with mild indignation, and was about to give it utterance when Octavia spoke. "Oh, Mrs. McIntyre, don't apologize for Teddy. Yes, I call him Teddy. So does everyone whom he hasn't duped into taking him seriously. You see, we used to cut paper dolls and play jackstraws together ages ago. No one minds what he says." "No," said Teddy, "no one minds what he says, just so he doesn't do it again." Octavia cast one of those subtle, sidelong glances toward him from beneath her lowered eyelids, a glance that Teddy used to describe as an uppercut. But there was nothing in his ingenuous, weather-tanned face to warrant a suspicion that he was making an allusion. Nothing. Beyond a doubt, thought Octavia, he had forgotten. "Mr. Westlake likes his fun," said Mrs. McIntyre, as she conducted Octavia to her rooms. "But," she added loyally, "people around here usually pay attention to what he says when he talks in earnest. I don't know what would have become of this place without him." End of Part 1 of Madame Bo-Peep of the Ranches. Section 26 of Whirligigs by O. Henry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Madame Bo-Peep of the Ranches, Part 2. 2 rooms at the east end of the house had been arranged for the occupancy of the ranch's mistress. When she entered them, a slight dismay seized her at their bare appearance and the scantiness of their furniture, but she quickly reflected that the climate was a semi-tropical one, and was moved to appreciation of the well-conceived efforts to conform to it. The sashes had already been removed from the big windows, and white curtains waved in the Gulf breeze that streamed through the wide jalousies. The bare floor was amply strewn with cool rugs. The chairs were inviting, deep, dreamy willows. The walls were papered with a light, cheerful olive. One whole side of her sitting room was covered with books on smooth, unpainted pine shelves. She flew to these at once. Before her was a well-selected library. She caught glimpses of titles of volumes of fiction and travel not yet seasoned from the dampness of the press. Presently, recollecting that she was now in a wilderness given over to mutton, centipedes, and privations, the incongruity of these luxuries struck her, and, with intuitive feminine suspicion, she began turning to the fly-leaves of volume after volume. Upon each was inscribed in fluent characters the name of Theodore Westlake, Jr. Octavia, fatigued by her long journey, retired early that night. Lying upon her white, cool bed, she rested deliciously, but sleep coquetted long with her. She listened to faint noises whose strangeness kept her faculties on the alert. The fractious yelping of the coyotes, the ceaseless, low symphony of the wind, the distant booming of the frogs about the lake, the lamentation of the concertina in the Mexicans' quarters. There were many conflicting feelings in her heart: thankfulness and rebellion, peace and disquietude, loneliness and a sense of protecting care, happiness and an old haunting pain. She did what any other woman would have done, sought relief in a wholesome tide of unreasonable tears, and her last words, murmured to herself before slumber, capitulating, came softly to woo her, were, "He has forgotten." The manager of the Rancho de las Sombras was no dilettante. He was a hustler. He was generally up, mounted, and away on mornings before the rest of the household were awake, making the rounds of the flocks and camps. This was the duty of the major domo, a stately old Mexican with a princely air and manner. But Teddy seemed to have a great deal of confidence in his own eyesight. Except in the busy season, he nearly always returned to the ranch to breakfast at 8 o'clock, with Octavia and Mrs. McIntyre, at the little table set in the central hallway, bringing with him a tonic and breezy cheerfulness full of the health and flavor of the prairies. A few days after Octavia's arrival, he made her get out one of her riding skirts and curtail it to a shortness demanded by the chaparral brakes. With some misgiving, she donned this and a pair of buckskin leggings he prescribed in addition, and mounted upon a dancing pony, rode with him to view her possessions. He showed her everything: the flocks of ewes, muttons, and grazing lambs, the dipping vats, the shearing pens, the uncouth merino rams in their little pasture, the water tanks prepared against the summer drought, giving account of his stewardship with a boyish enthusiasm that never flagged. Where was the old Teddy that she knew so well? This side of him was the same. It was a side that pleased her, but this was all she ever saw of him now. Where was his sentimentality, those old, varying moods of impetuous love-making, of fanciful, quixotic devotion, of heartbreaking gloom, of alternating absurd tenderness and haughty dignity? His nature had been a sensitive one, his temperament bordering closely on the artistic. She knew that, besides being a follower of fashion and its fads and sports, he had cultivated tastes of a finer nature. He had written things. He had tampered with colors. He was something of a student in certain branches of art. And once she had been admitted to all his aspirations and thoughts. But now, and she could not avoid the conclusion, Teddy had barricaded against her every side of himself except one, the side that showed the management of the Rancho de las Sombras, and a jolly chum who had forgiven and forgotten. Queerly enough, the words of Mr. Bannister's description of her property came into her mind, all enclosed within a strong barbed wire fence. "Teddy's fence, too," said Octavia to herself. It was not difficult for her to reason out the cause of his fortifications. It had originated one night at the Hammersmiths' ball. It occurred at a time soon after she had decided to accept Colonel Beaupré and his millions, which was no more than her looks and the entrée she held into the inner circles were worth. Teddy had proposed with all his impetuosity and fire, and she looked him straight in the eye and said, coldly and finally, "Never let me hear any such silly nonsense from you again." "You won't," said Teddy, with an expression around his mouth. And now Teddy was enclosed within a strong barbed wire fence. It was on this first ride of inspection that Teddy was seized by the inspiration that suggested the name of Mother Goose's heroine, and he at once bestowed it upon Octavia. The idea, supported by both a similarity of names and identity of occupations, seemed to strike him as a peculiarly happy one, and he never tired of using it. The Mexicans on the ranch also took up the name, adding another syllable to accommodate their lingual incapacity for the final P, gravely referring to her as La Madama Bo-Peep. Eventually it spread, and Madame Bo-Peep's ranch was as often mentioned as the Rancho de las Sombras. Came the long hot season from May to September, when work is scarce on the ranches. Octavia passed the days in a kind of lotus-eater's dream. Books, hammocks, correspondence with a few intimate friends, a renewed interest in her old watercolor box and easel. These disposed of the sultry hours of daylight. The evenings were always sure to bring enjoyment. Best of all were the rapturous horseback rides with Teddy, when the moon gave light over the wind-swept leagues, chaperoned by the wheeling nighthawk and the startled owl. Often the Mexicans would come up from their shacks with their guitars and sing the weirdest of heartbreaking songs. They were long, cozy chats on the breezy gallery, and an interminable warfare of wits between Teddy and Mrs. McIntyre, whose abundant Scotch shrewdness often more than overmatched the lighter humor in which she was lacking. And the nights came one after another, and were filed away by weeks and months. Nights soft and languorous and fragrant, that should have driven Stephane to Chloe over wires however barbed, that might have drawn Cupid himself to hunt, lasso in hand, among those amorous pastures, but Teddy kept his fences up. One July night, Madame Bo-Peep and her ranch manager were sitting on the east gallery. Teddy had been exhausting the science of prognostication as to the probabilities of a price of 24 cents for the autumn clip, and had then subsided into an anesthetic cloud of Havana smoke. Only as incompetent a judge as a woman would have failed to note long ago that at least a third of his salary must have gone up in the fumes of those imported regalias. "Teddy," said Octavia, suddenly and rather sharply, "why are you working down here on a ranch for?" 100 per, said Teddy glibly, and found. "I've a good mind to discharge you." "Can't do it," said Teddy with a grin. "Why not?" demanded Octavia, with argumentative heat. "Under contract. Terms of sale respect all unexpired contracts. Mine runs until 12 p.m. December 31st. You might get up at midnight on that date and fire me. If you try sooner, I'll be in a position to bring legal proceedings." Octavia seemed to be considering the prospect of litigation. "But," continued Teddy cheerfully, "I've been thinking of resigning anyway." Octavia's rocking chair ceased its motion. There were centipedes in this country, she felt sure, and Indians, and vast, lonely, desolate, empty wastes, all within strong barbed wire fence. There was a Van Dresser pride, but there was also a Van Dresser heart. She must know for certain whether or not he had forgotten. "Ah, well, Teddy," she said, with a fine assumption of polite interest, "it's lonely down here. You're longing to get back to the old life, to polo, and lobsters, and theaters, and balls." "Never cared much for balls," said Teddy virtuously. "You're getting old, Teddy. Your memory is failing. Nobody ever knew you to miss a dance unless it occurred on the same night with another one which you attended. And you showed such shocking bad taste, too, in dancing too often with the same partner. Let me see. What was that Forbes girl's name? The one with the wall eyes? Mabel, wasn't it?" "No, Adele. Mabel was the one with the bony elbows. That wasn't Wall in Adele's eyes. It was soul. We used to talk sonnets together. And Verlaine. Just then I was trying to run a pipe from the Pierian spring." "You were on the floor with her," said Octavia, undeflected. "5 times at the Hammersmiths'." "Hammersmiths what?" questioned Teddy, vacuously. "Ball," said Octavia, viciously. "What were we talking of?" "Eyes, I thought," said Teddy, after some reflection, "and elbows." "Those Hammersmiths," went on Octavia, in her sweetest society prattle, after subduing an intense desire to yank a handful of sunburnt, sandy hair from the head lying back contentedly against the canvas of the steamer chair, "had too much money. Mines, wasn't it? It was something that paid something to the ton. You couldn't get a glass of plain water in their house. Everything at that ball was dreadfully overdone." "It was," said Teddy. "Such a crowd there was," Octavia continued, conscious that she was talking the rapid drivel of a schoolgirl describing her first dance. "The balconies were as warm as the rooms. I lost something at that ball." The last sentence was uttered in a tone calculated to remove the barbs from miles of wire. "So did I," confessed Teddy, in a lower voice. "A glove," said Octavia, falling back as the enemy approached her ditches. "Cast," said Teddy, halting his firing line without loss. "I hobnobbed half the evening with one of the Hammersmiths miners, a fellow who kept his hands in his pockets and talked like an archangel about reduction plants and drifts and levels and sluice boxes." "A pearl gray glove, nearly new," sighed Octavia, mournfully. "A bang-up chap, that McArdle," maintained Teddy, approvingly. "A man who hated olives and elevators. A man who handled mountains as croquets and built tunnels in the air. A man who never uttered a word of silly nonsense in his life. Did you sign those lease renewal applications yet, Madama? They've got to be on file in the Land Office by the 31st." Teddy turned his head lazily. Octavia's chair was vacant. A certain centipede, crawling along the lines marked out by fate, expounded the situation. It was early one morning, while Octavia and Mrs. McIntyre were trimming the honeysuckle on the west gallery. Teddy had risen and departed hastily before daylight in response to word that a flock of ewes had been scattered from their bedding ground during the night by a thunderstorm. The centipede, driven by destiny, showed himself on the floor of the gallery, and then, the screeches of the 2 women giving him his cue, he scuttled with all his yellow legs through the open door into the furthermost west room, which was Teddy's. Arming themselves with domestic utensils selected with regard to their length, Octavia and Mrs. McIntyre, with much clutching of skirts and skirmishing for position of rear guard in the attacking force, followed. Once outside, the centipede seemed to have disappeared, and his prospective murderers began a thorough but cautious search for their victim. Even in the midst of such a dangerous and absorbing adventure, Octavia was conscious of an awed curiosity on finding herself in Teddy's sanctum. In that room he sat alone, silently communing with those secret thoughts that he now shared with no one, dreamed there whatever dreams he now called on no one to interpret. It was a room of a Spartan or a soldier. In one corner stood a wide canvas-covered cot, in another a small bookcase, in another a grim stand of Winchesters and shotguns. An immense table, strewn with letters, papers, and documents, surmounted by a set of pigeonholes, occupied one side. The centipede showed genius in concealing himself in such bare quarters. Mrs. McIntyre was poking a broom handle behind the bookcase. Octavia approached Teddy's cot. The room was just as the manager had left it in his hurry. The Mexican maid had not yet given it her attention. There was his big pillow, with the imprint of his head still in the center. She thought the horrid beast might have climbed the cot and hidden itself to bite Teddy. Centipedes were thus cruel and vindictive toward managers. She cautiously overturned the pillow, and then parted her lips to give the signal for reinforcements at the sight of a long, slender, dark object lying there. But, repressing it in time, she caught up a glove, a pearl gray glove flattened, it might be conceived, by many, many months of nightly pressure beneath the pillow of the man who had forgotten the Hammersmith's ball. Teddy must have left so hurriedly that morning that he had, for once, forgotten to transfer it to its resting place by day. Even managers who are notoriously wily and cunning are sometimes caught up with. Octavia slid the gray glove into the bosom of her summery morning gown. It was hers. Men who had put themselves within strong barbed-wire fence and remembered Hammersmith's balls only by the talk of miners about sluice boxes should not be allowed to possess such articles. After all, what a paradise this prairie country was! How it blossomed like the rose when you found things that were thought to be lost! How delicious was that morning breeze coming in the windows, fresh and sweet with the breath of the yellow ratama blooms! Might one not stand for a minute with shining, far-gazing eyes and dream that mistakes might be corrected? Why was Mrs. McIntyre poking about so absurdly with a broom? "I found it," said Mrs. McIntyre, banging the door. "Here it is." "Did you lose something?" asked Octavia, with sweetly polite non-interest. "The little devil," said Mrs. McIntyre, driven to violence. "You've not forgotten him already." Between them they slew the centipede. Thus he was rewarded for his agency toward the recovery of things lost at the Hammersmiths' ball. It seems that Teddy, in due course, remembered the glove, and when he returned to the house at sunset, made a secret but exhaustive search for it. Not until evening, upon the moonlit eastern gallery, did he find it. It was upon the hand that he had thought lost to him forever, and so he was moved to repeat certain nonsense that he had been commanded never to utter again. Teddy's fences were down. This time there was no ambition to stand in the way, and the wooing was as natural and successful as it should be between ardent shepherd and gentle shepherdess. The prairies changed to a garden. The Rancho de las Sombras became the Ranch of Light. A few days later Octavia received a letter from Mr. Bannister, in reply to one she had written to him asking some questions about her business. A portion of the letter ran as follows: "I am at a loss to account for your reference to the sheep ranch. 2 months after your departure to take up your residence upon it, it was discovered that Colonel Beaupre's title was worthless. A deed came to light showing that he had disposed of the property before his death. The matter was reported to your manager, Mr. Westlake, who at once repurchased the property. It is entirely beyond my power of conjecture to imagine how you have remained in ignorance of this fact. I beg that you will at once confer with that gentleman, who will, at least, corroborate my statement." Octavia sought Teddy with battle in her eyes. "What are you working on this ranch for?" she asked once more. 100, he began to repeat, but saw in her face that she knew. She held up Mr. Bannister's letter in her hand. He knew that the game was up. "It's my ranch," said Teddy, like a schoolboy detected in evil. "It's a mighty poor manager that isn't able to absorb the boss's business if you give him time." "Why were you working down here?" pursued Octavia, still struggling after the key to the riddle of Teddy. "To tell the truth, Tave," said Teddy, with quiet candor, "it wasn't for the salary. That about kept me in cigars and sunburn lotions. I was sent South by my doctor. 'Twas the right lung that was going to the bad, on account of over-exercise and strain at polo and gymnastics. I needed climate and ozone and rest, and things of that sort." In an instant Octavia was close against the vicinity of the affected organ. Mr. Bannister's letter fluttered to the floor. It's well now, isn't it, Teddy?" "Sound as a mesquite chunk. I deceived you in one thing. I paid $50,000 for your ranch as soon as I found you had no title. I had just about that much income accumulated at my banker's while I've been herding sheep down here. So it was almost like picking the thing up on a bargain counter for a penny. There's another little surplus of unearned increment piling up there. Tave, I've been thinking of a wedding trip in a yacht, with white ribbons tied to the mast, through the Mediterranean, and then up among the Hebrides and down Norway to the Zuyder Zee. "And I was thinking," said Octavia softly, "of a wedding gallop with my manager among the flocks of sheep, and back to a wedding breakfast with Mrs. McIntyre on the gallery, with maybe a sprig of orange blossom fastened to the red jar above the table." Teddy laughed and began to chant: "Little Bo-Peep has lost her sheep, and doesn't know where to find 'em. Let 'em alone, they'll come home, and—" Octavia drew his head down and whispered in his ear: "But that is one of the tales they brought behind them." End of Madame Bo-Peep of the Ranches, Part 2. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of Whirligigs by O. Henry.